To further dissect Kim's trip to Beijing, we have with us Dr. Jong-yeop, a research fellow from the Sejong Institute. It's good to have you on the show today.
My pleasure.
So, Kim's surprise visit to Beijing has now concluded. We're hearing reports that he's returning to Pyongyang on his special train that he came on. Now, he held this summit with Xi Jinping on Tuesday, and they're said to have spoken for about an hour. And obviously, they met for dinner as well, and they met for lunch today, according to the reports. What is your review of this trip that Kim has made over the last couple of days?
So North Korea has been very dormant in the later half of last year, and there was no real exchange between North Korea and China and North Korea and Russia at the time. So the United States was wondering what would be in North Korea's mind when they have very active approach to the international community in the earlier half of 2018, but not that active in the later half of 2018. So now North Korea is approaching China, even though we don't know yet what was exactly discussed between two leaders. However, since based on New Year's address by Chairman Kim, that it is obvious that North Korea is trying to have direct talk with President Trump as soon as possible by skipping that working level or high level talks with the U.S. government officials. So North Korea is trying to take advantage of this opportunity to visit China by sending the message directly to President Trump that it might to the President Trump, so he can consider the meeting with the Chairman Kim earlier than it is now considering within the U.S. domestic politics.
So then, does this suggest that the North Korea-U.S. summit is actually going to happen?
So I think I have to hold a definite answer for that question, because now U.S. government officials demand high-level talks, which is followed by the working-level talks with regard to how to denuclearize North Korea in more detail. Because United States government officials believe that fixing the date first for the second summit would be jeopardized that any progress can be made in the working-level or high-level talks. So now United States wants to have these working level group talks before the summit, but President Trump already mentioned his interest in the second summit, and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un sent his message to President Trump through his New Year's address and the personal letter. And by visiting China this time, he sent a direct message to President Trump. Then he wants President Trump to consider the more expedited meeting with him without having that working level talks. So North Korea sent his message. So I think now we have to see what kind of dynamics is there between U.S. government officials and the President Trump.
Because, as you mentioned, on New Year's Day, Kim Jong-un gave his annual New Year's address where he said if the U.S. continues its sanctions and pressure campaign, the regime would have no choice but to reconsider a, quote, a new way, as he mentioned. Is Kim perhaps signaling or even warning that this relationship with China as well is this new way that he's talking about?
There are some reports that Chairman Kim's visit to China this time is a way of insinuating what that new way means to the United States. So if United States is not providing those things that North Korea wants, such as sanction relief and other corresponding measures, then North Korea would find another way to survive. So So in the New Year's address, Chairman Kim emphasized several times about socialist ideologies and its cooperation with the socialist countries. So someone might interpret that as North Korea's new way to survive if United States is not relieve the sanctions or pressure onto North Korea. But at this stage, it's not the time yet for North Korea to give any ultimatum to the United States yet. And Chairman Kim is clearly indicating that he wants to have a talk with the United States. So until that second summit is held between President Trump and Chairman Kim, I don't think North Korea is trying to say anything that can be interpreted as an ultimatum, or he is really trying to find a new way other than talking with the United States.
Kim's schedule has been quite interesting as well. Before he left today, he actually visited a pharmaceutical factory in the Beijing's economic development zone. What do you think this tells us about Kim's objective for coming on this trip?
So this trip is reported to have a 3-night trip to China, but since he spent 1 night in his train when the train enters the Chinese territory, and he's on his train and he's going to spend another night in his train again. So it's basically a 1-night trip to Beijing. So if he uses the airplane, it's going to be just a 1-day trip. So the message that he's going to send by having this trip is how strong the bond between China and North Korea is, and at the same time that two-thirds of his New Year's address is given to the economy. He wants to send a message that he is really caring for the North Korea's economy, and this trip is about how to improve North Korea's economy. So I think that the visiting the pharmaceutical company itself is not that important, but by having the more important thing is what kind of message that he wants to deliver by having this trip to China this time.
So far, U.S. President Donald Trump hasn't made any sort of reply to Kim Jong-un's trip. That's perhaps not a surprise right now because there's so much on his plate with the U.S. shutdown. But even his administration, his State Department, haven't really given any sort of response yet. Why do you think that is?
So when United States and President Trump criticized China as a negative element for the U.S.-North Korea talks, it was when North Korea changed its attitude after it initiated a talk with the United States. That is when President Trump criticized North Korea and the China meeting, because after Chairman Kim met President Xi, North Korea's attitude toward United States had changed. However, the context of the visit and the meeting between President Xi and Chairman Kim is different compared to the last year's meetings. So I think that United States is going to wait for more detailed message that can be delivered out of this trip. And there's a possibility that no detailed message would come out of directly from China or North Korea for this trip. So I think that United States is going to be in a waiting mood until there is some kind of message directly coming from North Korea.
Again, the timing of this trip is also interesting because concurrently in Beijing right now, U.S. officials are there to hold trade talks with Chinese officials as well. And the ongoing trade dispute, obviously, between U.S. and China has been causing a massive rupture in the global economy as well. But Trump has previously accused Xi Jinping and Beijing for using the situation with North Korea as a kind of bargaining chip for this for the trade dispute as well. I mean, do you think Trump's concerns are justified at all? And do you think they might have some sort of influence during this trip that Kim Jong-un has just made as well?
So when President Trump first met President Xi in Mar-a-Lago, Florida in 2017, he himself mentioned that he withheld the trade war with China because of North Korea issues. So I think it's natural for President Xi wanting to take advantage of that kind of element in his dispute with the United States in trade. So I think it's natural for China to use all the elements that they can use in the trade talks with the United States. I think that's one reason why the trip by Kim Jong-un to China is extended to like 3 nights when it's just a one-day trip. So now, while the trade talks is continuing between China and the United States, in the whole process has to be affected by this trip. So if it's like one-day trip, then the period of effect is rather short. But having this like 3-night trip, the effect of Kim Jong-un's visit to China has much longer and a stronger effect to the trade talks. I think that's what President Trump was seeking by having this Kim Jong-un's trip to China this time.
Do you think it was deliberate that they timed it this way? Because Kim Jong-un's trip came as very much of a surprise, whereas we knew the trade talks between China and the U.S. were coming up a couple of weeks ago. So do you think it might have been a deliberate timing tactic by either Xi Jinping or even Kim Jong-un?
So I think that there should be consideration of having meetings specifically at this time, because now China postponed that U.S. tariff policy for 90 days, and these trade talks is going to determine that what kind of outcome that United States and China is going to have. So whether tariff or no tariff will be determined by trade talks. And the two countries have to make a conclusion within like 2 months. So considering the importance of the trade talks, that Chinese government probably wants to take all the elements that they can bring. So I think we can safely argue that China is deliberately choosing the dates of Kim Jong-un's visit at the same time that they are having trade talks with the United States.
Interesting. Now that Kim has left Beijing and he's on his way back to Pyongyang, the question becomes, what comes next? Can we now expect the high-level talks between US and North Korea that have been postponed for several months now to happen, restart and take place and possibly lead towards a North Korea-U.S. summit between Trump and Kim?
So even though President Trump himself mentioned to the media that he's negotiating the location for the second summit, but there's no sign that there's any progress between United States and North Korea. And the discrepancies that they have been showing is that whether there's going to be high-level talks followed by working-level talks before fixing the date for the second summit. So North Korea wants to have direct talk with the President Trump first without having any kind of high-level or working-level talks with the United States. But at the same time, U.S. government officials demand North Korea to have these working-level group talks before fixing the date for the second summit. So I think one thing that our government can play a role this time is to narrow that differences between two countries by having some kind of facilitating role between two countries.
And finally, briefly before we go, so now that there's talk of this U.S. summit keeps coming up, there's also, from South Korea's perspective, we're thinking perhaps they could lead to a South Korea, North Korea summit as well, where Kim Jong-un comes to Seoul as promised last year. With that in mind, do you think there's anything South Korea can do at this stage to kind of push things forward, especially President Moon?
So I think that Chairman Kim's visit to Seoul probably would be after there's some kind of outcome favorable to North Korea at the second summit between Trump and Kim. So for South Korea, the most important part to bring about Kim Jong-un's, Chairman Kim's visit to Seoul is first make the second summit between Trump and Kim actually happening. So for that matter, it's very important for South Korean government to have facilitating role by narrowing the differences between U.S. and North Korea. I think that means that it might be better for South Korean government to persuade North Korea to have some kind of working level group talks or high level talks with the United States. And from there, I think it can be like expedited between United States and North Korea to have a second summit.
I think that's where we'll close it out. Thank you for coming in today and sharing us your thoughts.
Thank you.